Missing time is a gap in conscious memory identified with a certain time period. This gap can span a few minutes to a few hours to a few days in length. Memories of instances occurring during that time period often have to be retrieved by hypnosis or through dreams. An individual experiencing missing time would be performing an everyday task or travelling somewhere. At some point, this person will awaken and check their watch again and notice some minutes or hours have passed during which they have no memory. The following are 3 cases of missing time. Peter Williamson. In the summer of 1974, a bizarre occurrence took place in the life of Peter Williamson, a resident of Somerset in southwest England. On that summer day, Peter was enjoying a barbecue in his garden along with his wife Mary. The weather had been pleasant earlier, but an electrical storm had recently passed through the area. During the storm, the Williamsons' dog had apparently been frightened by a loud thunderclap and was now cowering under a tree in the garden. Feeling sympathy for the animal, Peter decided to take it back inside the house to comfort it. However, as he approached the tree, there was an extremely bright flash of lightning. At that very instant, to Mary's complete astonishment, her husband vanished into thin air. Mary immediately called the emergency services in a state of extreme distress. After being sedated by paramedics, she was brought to stay with friends while the Williamson children were sent to stay elsewhere. Over the next 3 days, police scoured the countryside but could find no trace whatsoever of Peter. One theory put forward was that the lightning flash or accompanying thunderclap had temporarily disoriented the couple, causing them to miss seeing what had actually transpired. Some experts speculated that Peter himself may have experienced amnesia after being directly struck by lightning, leading him to wander off aimlessly. Then, at approximately 8 a.m. on the 3rd day after his bizarre disappearance, Peter was discovered lying unconscious in a patch of shrubbery in the locked garden of a neighbour close by. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere. One of his legs was partially submerged in a garden pond. It was an extremely perplexing situation, as the gardener who stumbled upon Peter confirmed he possessed the only key to enter the locked garden gate. After Peter was transported to the hospital, physicians determined he was suffering from extreme exhaustion and shock. However, he had no memory whatsoever of any events taking place over the preceding 3 days. Over the subsequent nights spent in the hospital bed, Peter began having intensely vivid, coherent dreams. In them, he clearly envisioned himself standing alone in the middle of an unfamiliar garden in the dead of night. His clothing and hair were completely soaked through to the skin. As if guided by some unseen force, in Peter's dreams he was wandering aimlessly along dark country roads, all the while remaining in an utterly confused, disoriented state. Eventually, in this recurring dream, a soaked and dishevelled Peter is discovered in the garden and taken to a nearby hospital to receive urgent medical treatment. Still in a dreamlike state, Peter was able to recall specific details: a treating physician's name, a nursing sister, multiple nurses on rotation, as well as the name of the ward he occupied. Bizarrely, the hospital room would occasionally appear to shimmer around him, as if obscured by some invisible veil or force field. Periodically, throughout his dream hospitalization, pieces of furniture or equipment would seem to spontaneously manifest where none had stood previously. The room would then abruptly return to normal as quickly as it had changed. As Peter's overall condition gradually improved over the course of the week in dream space, he was permitted brief supervised walks just outside the facility for fresh air and exercise. During one such outing, strolling down a tree-lined lane bordering the grounds, an eerie sensation of familiarity began washing over him. However, the dream recollection always terminates at precisely the same movement moving forward, with Peter instantaneously regaining consciousness beside the pond where he had originally been discovered. Upon emerging from his coma and relating this intricately detailed recurring dreamscape experience to his doctors, they agreed to investigate and attempt identifying this hospital from his descriptions. Remarkably, there existed a tiny freestanding cottage infirmary situated close by that perfectly matched the specifics outlined, right down to the ward name and the staff physician and nurses referenced by Peter. Yet when contacted, the physician from the cottage hospital confirmed having no recollection whatsoever of any patient matching Peter's description. A comprehensive review of their patient records failed to turn up any evidence he'd even been admitted there, much less spend a week occupying a bed in their care. One simplistic theory broached was that Peter's mind had manufactured an elaborate fabricated dream consisting of nothing more than trivial fragments of reality overheard at some point about the cottage hospital. However, this fails to account for the level of granular detail recounted or explain the uncanny alignment with a place no one can recall him visiting. An alternate hypothesis raised was that somehow, amid the disorienting lightning strike, Peter had temporarily shifted into inhabiting a parallel Earth or nearby reality essentially identical to our own. Perhaps across the breadth of existence, multiple dimensional iterations of Peter Williamson vanished into thin air that summer night, each from their own slightly differentiated plane of reality. If so, maybe in one or more such realms, an alternate Peter returned just as mysteriously a few days later to loving wives and families. Yet each returned Peter evidencing a subtle shift in memories or personality, suggesting he originated not from that precise world, but had crossed over there from another neighbouring one. Paul Ellis. In the early hours of a September morning in 1973, 21-year-old Paul was driving through the small village of Little Horton in the English Midlands. As he passed by the church clock, he noted that the time was about 2 a.m, but from that moment onward, Paul lost all sense of time, until he found himself wandering on foot near the town of Bromham, some 60 miles away. Paul was completely drenched, although it was not currently raining. There was no sign of his car, and he appeared to have no obvious injuries. Moreover, it was now daylight, around 7 a.m. After gathering his bearings, Paul went to the home of a friend who lived nearby and recounted his baffling experience. His friend then drove Paul along the A428 road, retracing the route back towards Little Horton, where Paul last recalls seeing the church clock. About 5 miles from Bromham, near the small village of Turvey, Paul and his friend discovered Paul's car sitting in the middle of a muddy field. Strangely, there were no tyre tracks showing how the car could have entered the field from the closed gate. The car doors were still locked, with Paul's keys still in his pocket, and the vehicle seemingly entirely undamaged from any kind of accident. Due to the thick mud caused by heavy rains during the missing 5 hours, the farmer had to tow Paul's car out using his tractor. Nearly 2 years after this unexplained event, Paul suddenly experienced a flashback to what had transpired. He now recalled driving out of Little Horton and seeing a fuzzy white glow heading rapidly towards his windshield. After that, there was only darkness until Paul regained awareness while wandering near Bromham at around 7 a.m. The 5-hour gap remained an absolute mystery to Paul and his friends. In subsequent years, he would recount the strange experience to many acquaintances as one of the strangest occurrences of his life. George Ramos. George was a travelling sales representative for a chemical company based in Lahares, a city in the state of Espírito Santo in southeastern Brazil. On the evening of April the 20th, 1981, the then 32-year-old George set off from his home in Linhares to drive to a business meeting a few miles away. He told his wife Numia that he would be back later that night. However, he never arrived at the meeting. The next morning, on April the 21st, the Volkswagen that George had been driving was discovered abandoned on a side road just outside of Linhares by a local resident. The resident contacted the Linhares Police Department to report the seemingly deserted vehicle. When police officers arrived at the scene, they found the car with its key still in the ignition and George's various sales samples and files for the scheduled business meeting undisturbed inside. It appeared as if George had vanished without a trace while en route to his appointment the previous evening. There were no signs of any kind of struggle either, inside or outside of the car. The Volkswagen was taken into police custody for forensic analysis and testing, but after several days, investigators remained unable to uncover any clues as to George's whereabouts. An official missing persons report was filed by his wife, Numia, on April the 22nd. Then, 5 days after George's initial disappearance on the night of April the 20th, Numia received an unexpected and frantic phone call from her husband. George hurriedly explained that he'd been driving along the road to his business meeting when he suddenly noticed a bright white glow approaching the car. Before he could properly react, the glow had completely enveloped the vehicle. He described feeling an intense sensation of pressure, almost paralysing his body and causing mild tingling pains in his muscles. Moments later, he entered a hazy, dreamlike state. When he eventually awoke, the car was gone, and he found himself standing disoriented on the side of an unfamiliar road, his body still sore. George had no recollection of how he'd gotten there. Desperate for answers and medication to relieve his lingering muscle pains, George set out to find the nearest pharmacy. However, upon arriving at a local chemist shop, he discovered a far more shocking truth. It was now April the 25th, 5 days after he initially set off for his meeting. Additionally, the pharmacy he had entered was in the rural town of Goiânia, an astounding 600 miles away from where his car was found abandoned outside Linhares nearly a week prior. Somehow, George had travelled over half the length of Brazil in a matter of minutes, losing 5 days in the process, with no memory of how he had traversed such an immense distance. Just what exactly had caused his bizarre teleportation and missing time?